Thank you again, Sarah, for taking the time to chat today. Yeah, and we're really just going to be talking about a little bit of the work you do with emerging companies, venture capital, what lawyers can do for startups. But before jumping into that, Sarah O'Gorman is a special counsel at Cooley, a startup firm through and through. And Sarah, before we get into kind of what an attorney can provide to startups, why did you decide that you wanted to even work with startups as an attorney?
It's a great question. Well, first, thanks so much for having me. Really excited to be here and to be partnering with Harvard and HLEP on this. So for me, what really intrigued me about the idea of working with startups is the opportunity to get to meet so many smart people that have these really exciting and new ideas. And as a person who might not be thinking in technology or might not be in the science or biotech world, being able to utilize the skills that I do have as a lawyer and help these really interesting, groundbreaking companies get started and start to grow.
And I think that message is compelling to a lot of the members of the Harvard Law Entrepreneurship Project. I know for me, I'm really interested in working with startups. But from a startup perspective, they've got a lot of different priorities going on. They're, wearing a lot of different hats. Some people call it building the plane while flying it. So, given the competing priorities, when is it the right time to bring in an attorney in that venture?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly there are levels of being more hands-on, hands-off with attorneys. Just, as a lawyer who deals with startup companies all the time, we are very well aware that startups are cash strapped. You don't want to be spending hundreds or thousands of dollars for a ton of over lawyering, especially in a space where maybe you're willing to take a little bit of risk. But certainly, in our experience, it's better to get involved with a lawyer early to avoid early stage pitfalls that will only lead to needing to do more extensive cleanup as you grow, which can actually result in you needing more lawyers and paying more money down the line to clean up things. So, certainly, as you're looking at actually forming an entity, as you're looking at hiring, as you're starting to generate any IP, those are kind of the things that you really should be talking to someone who does this consistently, so that you can get some good advice to make sure you're avoiding common pitfalls and setting the company up for success, so you don't have to be doing a ton of cleanup down the road on things that you might have missed. Most of them can be cleaned up. There are things that are more difficult, so it's really important to talk to someone early on to make sure you're kind of setting yourself up for success.
So, you mentioned hiring employees. A big part of that with startups specifically is paying people in equity or shares of the company.
Yep.
What does it look like for an attorney to be advising on that issue?
Yeah, I mean, so since we see this kind of day in, day out, we can offer some perspectives on what is, quote market, what we see a lot of our clients doing in terms of percentages that different roles at the company might get, or what is, kind of standard to offer someone, what is common in terms of vesting and those types of provisions. But also equity it's important and it's complicated in terms of making sure you get it papered correctly to make sure that someone is getting what you think they are owed, and also getting it without potential tax issues that can, really impact the benefit of that equity grant to the early stage employee. So that's certainly a place where we can offer a lot of both, guidance along what is market, and also make sure the paperwork is being done correctly, that we're crossing the I's and dotting the T's as you should.
And so is that a pretty standard process? I know you said sometimes people come in with a messy cap table or messy forms. Why is that?
I think it's when we see messiness on early stage companies, I think a lot of it comes from wanting to try to do it yourself to avoid legal costs, which we completely understand. And certainly for any law firm that works with startups, we try to be as efficient as possible to keep your legal fees down. So I think a lot of times the mistakes and hiccups come from trying to take on too much internally when you might not necessarily know all the rules or know how things are supposed to work. And that can lead to some of that messiness. And then, like I mentioned, the having to do some cleanup down the road.
So what is that cleanup process like?
It really depends on what the issue is. Many things can be cleaned up in terms of, call it corporate governance, missing board meetings. Maybe you hadn't properly appointed your board or your officers, things like that, we can address. Equity can be a tricky one because you have to be issuing equity at various, valuations. So there are a lot of tax implications that come into improperly issuing equity when you thought you had, and there are only depending on the issues, so many ways that we can fix it. And sometimes it is hard to get the employees or founders back to where they thought they were, just because if they missed certain elections, if they didn't get the proper paperwork, there's only so much that can be done to get them back to where they thought they had set their cap table up.
On the note of equities, obviously that's used as a form of compensation for employees, but a large part of that is used to invest, or sorry, not invest, but to raise money from even early stage angel investors. Maybe you have a friend, a connection, a relative, a somebody who you found who's saying, "I'm willing to take a chance," even before the main venture capitalists come in. And I know a lot of times startups, especially if there's a personal connection there, they think about managing that relationship from a relational perspective of, okay, I want to make sure they understand all this money could go to nothing because it's a risky business. But what are some other legal concerns that they need to be thinking about when managing these relationships, especially with angel investors?
Yeah, I mean, one thing from the company's perspective is actually thinking about how much money you need to be raising and not raising too much money too soon. Something that we actually do see some companies do is if they have angel investors, they have family and friends that want to support the business, they might take on, some early stage financing on very early terms because the company is new, that's not very highly valued. And as the company grows, the impact of taking on too much money on too early terms can actually be detrimental to the ownership that the founders and employees have in the business, and as well as can hinder, um, more venture capitalists wanting to come in because the terms were so favorable to the really early stage. So that's one pitfall that we do sometimes see is not tying your kind of angel investment round to what the current needs of the business and taking in everything that you can versus kind of thinking about just raising what you really need to get to that next stage of the business.
And then thinking about this strategic outlook, you're talking about stages of the business. Um, Founders, I think a lot of times are not just thinking about, okay, how do we get revenue, but also how do I maintain control? And so, how does that aspect of control and ownership interplay with maybe some of these later stages, maybe even with angel investing?
Yeah, so I mean, there's kind of two levels of control, right? There's the control at the stockholder level is actually how much of the business does the founder continue to own as they might raise money and be issuing additional equity, which is dilutive to them. And then the second piece is the control of the board on more of the day-to-day operations of the company. Um, so that is one thing where, as the company grows, obviously, and the valuation increases, you're bringing in venture capitalists. They might expect a board seat. The venture capitalists want to take as much of the pie as they can, and kind of making sure that we're balancing that level of control. That you're bringing in people onto your board that are going to be good advisors, that will allow you to have as a founder, a voice on the board, but also bringing someone else in that might have more experience than you is that balancing act between giving up certain controls for a gain in terms of market experience, capital, all of those things. And that's always a balancing act, which, is impacted very much by the market and what, the ability to raise money when you need it. Certainly the last couple of years have been more difficult. So we've been seeing much more investor favorable terms come out, meaning that the investors might be looking to gain more control for less money or the same amount of money they might have had to invest a few years ago. So it's always driven by various factors, but a huge piece of, the role that we can offer as venture capital lawyers is to help kind of lay out the impact of these financing raises and the loot and what the control dynamics will mean down the road in terms of who is controlling your board, whose stockholder consent is needed to take certain actions, and what that means for the company as it continues down its life cycle.
And something you alluded to earlier was papering all of this.
Mhm.
The NVCA, or the National Venture Capital Association, has these model documents, which kind of create a boilerplate form. But even within that, there's some negotiation possible.
Mhm.
Are there certain terms that you find are more often negotiated and others that are maybe usually pretty standard and people stick with the regular form?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so the most heavily negotiated points actually still tie to that, what we were just talking about in terms of control and ownership, in terms of at the stockholder level, what stockholder votes are needed to take certain actions in terms of, do I need to go out to my investors to take on debt? Do I need to go out to my investors to raise my next round of financing? Those types of things. And then the board seat as well is a big one in terms of what your board composition is going to look like and who is going to control the board. Is it going to be the founders? Is it going to be the investors? Are you going to have independence? And how is that dynamic going to allow you to run the business on a more of a day-to-day level? So those themes of control, ownership, you know, votes required to take action is the crux of the most important things that we negotiate. But certainly the second one being, the economics of the deal itself in terms of what is the price that the investor is coming in at? In a sale of the company, what are those terms going to look like in terms of the waterfall and the proceeds payable to everyone on the cap table? And what control and uh, blocks do certain folks have to drive those terms?
And so, to wrap up this conversation, I'd like to take a step back from the more nitty-gritty details of law and rely more on your experience just of years in the industry. Is there any area of startups that's exciting to you that you think is going to be growing soon?
Oh, many. AI is obviously a huge one. We've been seeing tons of AI companies pop up over the last year in many different spaces with many different applications. So that's a really interesting one that will certainly keep evolving. And, obviously on the legal side, there's a lot of questions about what is that law going to look like, and that's really driving changes in privacy law, cyber law, things like that. So that's a really interesting evolving piece. But separately, and this is more of a personal one, at Cooley, we do a lot of work with, biotech and life sciences companies. And as a person who, only took high school bio and has no science background whatsoever, being able to be a part of companies that are looking at, curing Alzheimer's, that are looking at, oncology treatments, therapies for various diseases that, really impact you know, family members, people that we know, is a really exciting and rewarding place to be. That the skills that I have as a lawyer can actually, impact, day-to-day, lives and increases or improvements in medical care.
That's awesome. And yes, I'm excited about both of those areas as well. Certainly here in Boston, there's a lot of investment, a lot of action happening in
Mhm.
each of those spaces. And at the Visionaries and Ventures Convention, we'll be having panels on both biotech and on AI, as well as a lot of other topics that we talked about today. So, Sarah, thank you so much for taking the time to chat and to promote the VVC event we have coming up here on November 17th. And just thank you for the Cooley relationship that you've invested in and investing in the Harvard Law Entrepreneurship Project.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me.